Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. The next day, Mark woke up to the sound of the rain tapping softly against his window. He had spent the entire night turning over Eleanor's proposition in his mind, trying to figure out if he was crazy for even considering it. But when he looked at the bills on his kitchen table, the overdue rent, the student loans, and the debts that seemed to pile higher with each passing day, he knew he was running out of options. He had to make a decision. His pride was slipping away with every passing minute, but his survival instinct was taking over. Mark dressed quickly and grabbed his things, heading out the door. His heart was still racing as he arrived at Brooks Bistro. He glanced up at the sign, its golden letters reflecting in the rain-soaked pavement, and a sense of finality washed over him. This was it. He had agreed to meet Eleanor again. As he stepped inside, the warm air of the bistro hit him, and the smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled his senses. He could already see Eleanor waiting for him at a corner table, her posture straight, her gaze focused on a tablet in front of her. She looked every bit the powerful woman she had portrayed on the phone, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made Mark feel small, almost like he was in over his head. "Mr. Davis," Eleanor greeted him coolly, setting her tablet aside as he sat down. Her sharp blue eyes met his, and for a moment, Mark hesitated. He had 1,000 questions, but none of them felt right to ask. She had offered him a way out, and he was here to find out what this deal would cost him. "I've thought about your offer," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "And I'm willing to hear more about the terms." "Good," Eleanor replied with a calm smile, as if she had been expecting this answer all along. "Let's get one thing clear first. This marriage will be purely business. No emotions. No expectations. Just a contract. You will act as my husband when needed, accompany me to events, handle some personal matters that require a public figure. But there will be no real marriage. Do you understand?" Mark nodded, but his stomach twisted. He couldn't help but feel like he was being sold, like a pawn in some kind of game. But what choice did he have? His options were slim, and this could be his way out of the mess he was in. "And in return," he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "In return, I will settle your debts, provide financial security for you and your family, and make sure you have the resources to pursue your career without any more stress. I'll also guarantee that you'll have a future without worrying about money. You'll be able to finish your law school without the constant weight of financial pressure," Eleanor explained, her voice calm, yet persuasive. "I'll give you the stability you've been looking for, and in exchange, I ask for your cooperation in this." Mark's mind raced. The offer was tempting. He couldn't deny that. But there was something unsettling about it. The coldness of it. The lack of any warmth or real connection. Still, it was a lifeline. A chance to pull himself out of the financial abyss he had been drowning in. But at what cost? "What about your family?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do they think about this arrangement?" Eleanor's expression remained unchanged. "My family doesn't need to know. This is between us. It's purely for public appearances and legal purposes. No one needs to know what happens behind closed doors." Mark sat back in his chair, his mind whirling. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, a steady drum of anxiety pounding in his chest. He had never been in a position like this before. To marry a stranger, a woman he had only just met, and for no reason other than to secure his future. It was a dangerous game, but he could see no other way. "Not now. I need some time to think about the details," Mark said, standing up. He couldn't make this decision so quickly, even if everything inside him was telling him to take the offer. He needed to process it, weigh it out. Eleanor stood up as well, her eyes locked on his. You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision. But remember, this offer won't last forever, and there's no guarantee I'll offer it to you again. Think carefully, Mark. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The pressure was mounting, and he knew this was a turning point in his life. As he walked out of the bistro and back into the rain, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something huge, something that would change his life forever. He had no idea if this was the right choice, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was any longer. As Mark made his way back to his apartment, he could feel the tension in his chest growing with every step. This could be his only way out, but was it worth it? Could he go through with this marriage of convenience? He couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's cold, calculating smile. He had to make his choice. Soon. The rain still fell heavily around him as he entered his apartment, but it couldn't wash away the uncertainty he felt. Tomorrow would be the day that changed everything. That night, Mark could not sleep. The rain had stopped, but the silence in his apartment was louder than ever. His mind replayed Eleanor's words over and over. No emotions. No expectations. Just a contract. He stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man agreed to something like that. But then he looked at the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the notice from his landlord, and the photo of his mother and younger sister smiling in better times. Reality hit hard. Pride would not pay the rent. Love would not feed his family. Survival came first. By sunrise, Mark had made his decision. He was going to do it. At exactly 9 in the morning, he walked back into Brooke's bistro. Eleanor was already there, sipping tea, her posture impeccable, her face unreadable. She looked up when she saw him approach, a faint smile touching her lips as if she already knew what his answer would be. So, have you decided, Mr. Davis? She asked calmly. Mark nodded slowly. I will do it, he said quietly. I will marry you. Eleanor set her teacup down with precision, the porcelain clicking softly against the saucer. Good, she said. Then let us get the paperwork started. There was no celebration, no relief, only the weight of something irreversible settling between them. A week later, Mark stood in a small courthouse in downtown Austin. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of papers and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The ceremony was brief, witnessed only by Eleanor's lawyer and a notary. Mark wore a suit Eleanor had sent to his apartment 2 days earlier, perfectly tailored but completely impersonal. As he repeated the vows, his voice was steady, though his chest felt tight. When the officiant finally said, "You may now exchange rings," Eleanor turned to him, her expression as calm as ever. She slipped a simple gold band onto his finger, and he did the same. There was no kiss. No applause. Just a signature on a document that bound two strangers together. As they stepped outside, rain began to fall again, thin and steady, washing over the courthouse steps. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes glinting beneath the gray sky. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said softly. Mark managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Brooks." The words felt foreign on his tongue, almost unreal. A black car waited for them at the curb, sleek and spotless. The driver opened the door, and Eleanor gestured for him to get in. The ride to her estate was silent. Mark stared out the window as the city faded into the distance, replaced by rolling hills and sprawling ranchland. The closer they got, the more he felt like he was being pulled into a world that was not his own. The gates of the Brooks estate stood tall and imposing, wrought iron and gold, opening slowly as the car approached. The mansion beyond was breathtaking, a massive stone structure surrounded by manicured gardens, marble fountains, and rows of ancient oak trees. It looked less like a home and more like a museum. When the car stopped, Mark stepped out and looked up at the house in awe. The air smelled of rain and roses. Everything was immaculate, precise, controlled just like Eleanor. She joined him on the steps, her heels clicking softly against the stone. "You will find everything you need inside," she said evenly. "Dinner is at 7. Do not be late." Then she turned and disappeared through the front doors, leaving him standing there in the drizzle. A housekeeper, a small woman in her 50s with kind eyes, appeared moments later. "This way, sir," she said politely. Mark followed her through grand hallways lined with portraits and chandeliers. The silence of the house was overwhelming. Every footstep echoed like a reminder that he did not belong here. The woman led him to a bedroom on the second floor. It was larger than his entire apartment, king-sized bed, antique furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect. Yet, despite the luxury, the room felt cold. Lifeless. As if no one had ever truly lived there. When the housekeeper left, Mark sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled. He looked around the room, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 7 days. 1 week ago, he was drowning in debt. Now, he was married to one of the wealthiest women in Texas and living in her mansion. But instead of feeling saved, he felt trapped. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at his reflection in the mirror across the room. The man looking back at him seemed like a stranger. "What have I done?" he whispered. That evening, when the grandfather clock downstairs chimed 7, Mark made his way to the dining room. The long mahogany table was set for 2, silverware gleaming under soft chandelier light. Eleanor sat at the far end, dressed elegantly in a silk blouse and pearls. She glanced up as he entered. "Punctual." "Good," she said, her tone neutral. Mark took a seat across from her, the distance between them stretching like a mile. Dinner was served: steak, roasted vegetables, and wine. The food was exquisite, but Mark could barely taste it. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. After a few moments of silence, he finally spoke. "So what happens now?" Eleanor set down her knife and looked at him calmly. "Now, Mr. Davis, we play our roles." Her voice was smooth, controlled, almost chilling. "And remember, in this house, appearances are everything." Days turned into weeks, and Mark slowly began to understand the rhythm of life inside Eleanor Brooks's mansion. Everything ran on a precise schedule. Breakfast was served at 8, lunch at 1, dinner at 7 sharp. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, addressing him as Mr. Davis, though he could see the curiosity in their eyes. To them, he was the young stranger who had somehow become their employer's husband overnight. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained as composed and distant as ever. She treated him with polite detachment, as if he were a business associate rather than a husband. During meals, their conversations were limited to surface-level topics: news headlines, charity events, business functions. Nothing personal, nothing real. The silence between them was a contract of its own. One morning, a housekeeper delivered a neatly typed schedule to Mark's room. It listed several upcoming events, including a charity gala for the Brooks Foundation. At the bottom, in Eleanor's crisp handwriting, was a note: attendance required. Formal attire. Mark stared at the paper, realizing this would be his first public appearance as her husband. The thought filled him with unease. He knew he was part of an image, a story Eleanor wanted the world to see. But what story was she trying to tell? Later that day, he found Eleanor in her study, reviewing documents under the warm glow of a brass lamp. Her desk was covered with files, each arranged with military precision. He cleared his throat. "About the gala, what exactly do you expect me to do?" She looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. "Stand by my side. Smile when needed. Do not speak unless spoken to. And above all, remember people will be watching." Mark hesitated. "You make it sound like a performance." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and cool. "It is." The night of the gala arrived sooner than he expected. The mansion's private driver escorted them to a grand hotel ballroom in downtown Austin, where glittering chandeliers reflected off crystal glasses and sequined gowns. Mark adjusted his tie, feeling uncomfortably out of place among Texas's elite. As they entered, cameras flashed, and heads turned. Eleanor slipped her arm through his, her grip light but firm. Smile, she murmured under her breath. He did, forcing his expression into something that resembled confidence. They moved gracefully through the crowd, greeting politicians, business magnates, and socialites who fawned over Eleanor. "Mrs. Brooks, you look radiant tonight," one man said, shaking her hand. She smiled politely. "Thank you. Have you met my husband, Mark Davis?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering before he composed himself. Yes. A pleasure." Mark nodded stiffly, feeling like an accessory rather than a person. Throughout the evening, Mark watched Eleanor work the room with effortless poise. She was charming, articulate, and perfectly in control. Every gesture, every word was deliberate. But as he studied her, he noticed fleeting moments when her smile faltered tiny cracks in her otherwise flawless mask. Once, when someone mentioned her late father, she stiffened almost imperceptibly before quickly changing the subject. It made Mark wonder if beneath her polished exterior was a loneliness as deep as his own. During a quiet moment between speeches, Eleanor stepped aside to check her phone. Mark followed her gaze and saw a photo of a younger Eleanor standing beside an older man with kind eyes. The caption read, "Brooks Industries, a legacy of excellence." He realized that this event was more than just a social gathering. It was a performance to uphold a legacy she refused to let die. Later that night, as they returned home, the car ride was silent except for the soft hum of the engine. Mark finally spoke. "You were incredible tonight." Eleanor looked out the window, her expression distant. "I have had years of practice." "Does it ever get tiring?" he asked quietly. She turned her head, meeting his gaze for the first time that evening. "What, pretending?" There was a long pause before she answered her own question. "It is not pretending if you have nothing else." The words lingered in the air like a shadow. Mark wanted to say anything but he could not find the right words. When they arrived back at the estate, Eleanor walked ahead toward her study while Mark lingered by the grand staircase. He looked around at the empty hall, the silence pressing against him. Every inch of this mansion gleamed with wealth, yet it felt hollow, like a museum filled with memories that no one dared to touch. He thought about his small apartment, the cluttered kitchen, the warmth of his mother's laughter. Somehow, that chaos had felt more alive than this perfection. Upstairs, in his room, he loosened his tie and sat on the edge of the bed. The gold ring on his finger glinted under the dim light, a symbol of a life he was not sure he belonged to. In the days that followed, Mark accompanied Eleanor to more public events. Each one was the same smiles, polite conversation, staged affection. But slowly, something shifted. He began to notice the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Once, late at night, he found her sitting alone in the garden, barefoot, staring at the fountain in silence. He almost walked away, but then she spoke without turning. "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" he asked softly, saying yes. He paused. "Every day and yet, not at all." She gave a small, sad smile. "Then we are not so different, Mr. Davis." For the first time, her voice held warm the flicker of something real in a world built on pretense. Weeks passed, and the contract marriage between Mark and Eleanor continued like clockwork. They lived under the same roof but in separate worlds. Every morning, Eleanor left early for meetings, and every evening she returned late, her expression as composed as ever. Mark tried to adjust to his new life: formal dinners, polite conversations, and endless appearances where every smile was rehearsed. But somewhere between the hollow laughter of charity events and the echoing silence of the mansion, he began to see cracks in Eleanor's perfect facade. She was not heartless. She was lonely. He could see it in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, in the way she lingered over old photographs in her study, in the quiet sighs that escaped her when she believed she was alone. One evening, Mark was walking through the west hallway when he noticed light spilling from the slightly open door of Eleanor's study. Inside, she sat at her desk, staring at an old photograph, the same one he had seen on her phone at the gala. It was her and her father. Her hand trembled slightly as she traced his face with her fingers. "You would hate what I have become," she whispered under her breath. Mark froze, unsure if he should reveal his presence. But before he could decide, she looked up. "You can come in, Mr. Davis," she said softly. Her tone carried none of the usual coldness. Mark stepped inside quietly. "I did not mean to intrude," he said. "You did not?" she replied, closing the photo frame. "I was just remembering." For a moment, the powerful, untouchable Eleanor Brooks looked fragile human. "He built this empire from nothing," she said quietly. "And when he died, I promised I would not let anyone destroy it. Not the board, not the vultures, not even time." Mark listened, feeling a strange pull in his chest. "You have kept that promise," he said gently. "Yes," she murmured, "but somewhere along the way, I forgot what it was all for." From that night on, something changed between them. The air felt different, less formal, more real. Eleanor started inviting Mark to her meetings, asking for his opinions, even sharing stories from her past. In turn, Mark began to see the woman beneath the armor, the daughter who had lost her father too soon, the leader carrying a legacy too heavy for one person to bear. And Eleanor began to see him not as a convenient husband, but as a man with integrity, intelligence, and quiet strength. Their conversations grew longer. Their silences grew softer. The line between their roles began to blur. One Saturday morning, Eleanor invited him to accompany her to a charity project in the outskirts of the city. It was a children's education center funded by the Brooks Foundation. For the first time, Mark saw Eleanor in her element, not as a CEO in a boardroom, but as a woman kneeling beside children, helping them draw and laugh. She smiled a real, unguarded smile, and it stunned him. On the drive back, the mood was lighter than it had ever been. The sun filtered through the car windows, and Eleanor leaned back in her seat, exhausted but peaceful. "You were good with them," Mark said, glancing at her. "You looked happy." She smiled faintly. "For a moment, I forgot who I am supposed to be." "Maybe that is not such a bad thing," he replied. She turned her head to look at him, her gaze softening. "Maybe not." It was the first time their eyes met without pretense, and something unspoken passed between them. That evening, as they returned home, Mark stopped by the garden before heading upstairs. The fountain lights shimmered in the dark, and the air was cool and still. He found himself replaying the image of Eleanor laughing with the children, her walls down for just a moment. For the first time since this marriage began, he realized he wanted to protect her, not because of their contract, but because he genuinely cared. Later that night, he passed by her study and saw her asleep at her desk, her head resting on folded arms. The lamp still glowed softly beside her. Without thinking, he walked in and gently placed a blanket over her shoulders. As he turned to leave, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mark," she said groggily. "You should sleep in your own bed," he replied with a faint smile. She looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you." It was such a simple word, but in her voice, it sounded fragile, honest. The next morning, Eleanor joined him for breakfast for the first time since they had married. She poured her own coffee, something she had never done before, and asked him about his mother and sister. Mark was taken aback but answered, telling her about his family, his late father, and his dreams of finishing law school. She listened quietly, genuinely interested. When he finished, she said softly, "You deserve more than what I offered you." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "So do you," he said. The moment lingered between them, filled with something neither dared to name. From then on, the walls between them began to crumble piece by piece, replaced by something warmer, something dangerously close to love. The following weeks felt strangely calm, as if a storm had finally passed through the Brooks mansion and left a softer kind of silence behind. The distance between Mark and Eleanor began to shrink in the smallest ways: a shared breakfast here, a quiet conversation in the garden there. The mansion, once cold and lifeless, started to feel less like a museum and more like a home. Eleanor laughed more often now, not the practiced, polished kind of laughter she used in public, but the real kind that came from somewhere deep inside. Mark found himself smiling too, sometimes for no reason at all. What had started as an arrangement was slowly turning into something genuine, something neither of them dared to define. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor appeared at Mark's study door holding 2 glasses of wine. She was barefoot, her hair down, dressed simply in a silk robe. "You look like you need a break," she said with a small smile. Mark chuckled, setting aside the papers he had been reading. "And you look like you already took one." She sat across from him, handing him a glass. "To surviving another week," she said softly, raising hers. He clinked his glass gently against hers. "To surviving and maybe even living," he replied. They both laughed, and for a moment the weight of their complicated reality disappeared. The conversation drifted easily from work to music to books they had read in college. It felt natural, effortless, like 2 people who had known each other for years. But beneath the easy words, there was something else building, an undercurrent neither could ignore. Later that night, Mark walked her to her room. At the door, she turned to him, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "You know," she said quietly, "I never expected this arrangement to feel comfortable." He smiled faintly. "Neither did I." Their eyes lingered on each other for a long moment, and then she said goodnight, her voice barely above a whisper. As he walked back to his room, Mark could not shake the feeling that something had changed between them forever. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with new energy. Eleanor had invited several executives and investors for a weekend retreat, a strategic move to strengthen the Brooks Foundation's partnerships. Mark attended as her husband, no longer just a name on paper but someone who genuinely stood beside her. Throughout the event, he noticed how people's attitudes toward him had shifted. The whispers and curiosity had faded, replaced by respect. Eleanor's confidence in him was clear. She introduced him as "my husband, Mark Davis," with a warmth that caught him off guard. Each time she said it, the word husband sounded a little less like a lie. That evening, after the guests had gone, Eleanor and Mark walked through the garden together. The air was cool, and the moonlight shimmered across the fountain. She stopped near the roses, touching one of the petals gently. "My father planted these," she said. "He used to say that roses only bloom when someone believes they can." Mark looked at her, his voice low. "Then he must have believed in you." She smiled sadly. "He did. I just stopped believing in myself." Mark took a slow step closer. "Then maybe it is time you start again." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between the man, understanding, a recognition of 2 lonely souls who had somehow found each other. Later that night, Mark sat alone in his room, unable to sleep. He thought about Eleanor, the way she smiled now, the way her guard had fallen just enough for him to see the woman beneath the armor. Somewhere along the line, he had stopped pretending. He was no longer acting the part of her husband. He was living it. And that realization scared him more than anything. Because for the first time, he wanted this life, not the money, not the mansion, but her. He wanted Eleanor Brooks. Not the CEO. Not the contract. Just her. The following day, Eleanor invited Mark to accompany her to the downtown headquarters for an important board meeting. As they entered the glass tower, the room filled with whispers. Some board members still viewed her marriage as a scandal, a strategic move to protect her position. But Eleanor silenced them with her composure and sharp intellect. When one of the older executives questioned Mark's presence, she looked directly at him and said, "My husband is here because I trust him. And that is something you cannot buy." The room went silent. After the meeting, as they rode down the elevator, Mark turned to her and said quietly, "You did not have to defend me." She looked up at him with a soft smile. "I was not defending you, Mark. I was telling them the truth." That night, dinner was quiet. They sat across from each other, the candlelight flickering between them. The air felt charged, alive. Mark finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Eleanor, do you ever wonder what would have happened if this had started differently? If it had not been a contract?" She met his eyes. "Every day. Silence filled the space between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time, they did not need words. The truth was already there in the way she looked at him, in the way his heart quickened when she smiled. The contract had created their story. But what was growing now was real. The shift between Mark and Eleanor was undeniable now, but with it came something neither of them expected: attention. Rumors began to circulate in the city's business circles. Whispers about Eleanor's young husband, questions about her motives, and speculation about whether their marriage was real or just another power move. The tabloids ran headlines like, "The widow billionaire and her boy husband." Eleanor tried to ignore them, but Mark could see how the words stung. One morning, as she sat at the breakfast table reading the paper, her expression tightened. "They do not care about the truth," she said, folding it with controlled anger. "They never have." Mark looked at her calmly. "Then why let them win?" She glanced up, surprised by his tone. "You think I am letting them?" "You are fighting them on their battlefield," he said softly. "Maybe it is time to change the rules." She stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if something in his words had struck a chord. But not everyone in Eleanor's world appreciated Mark's growing presence. At a corporate gala the following week, one of Eleanor's longtime board members, Richard Harlan, approached them with a smug smile. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, raising a glass, "I must say, your husband is quite the charming accessory." The insult was sharp, masked as humor, and it drew quiet laughter from the nearby guests. Mark felt his jaw tighten, but before he could speak, Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes cold. "Careful, Richard," she said evenly. "I may have chosen him as my partner, but I can always choose someone else to replace you." The laughter died instantly. Richard's smile faltered. Mark said nothing, but his chest filled with a quiet, fierce pride. For the first time, she had not just tolerated him, she had defended him. Later that night, back at the mansion, Eleanor poured herself a drink and handed one to Mark. "You did not have to say anything," she said. "But I did," he replied. "You have protected me more than once." "It was my turn." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening under the dim light. "You are a strange man, Mark Davis," she murmured. "Maybe that is why I needed you." He looked at her, his voice low. "Maybe that is why we needed each other." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was full of things neither could say aloud. But peace does not last long in a house built on appearances. The next morning, Eleanor's lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, arrived unannounced, his expression grave. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, handing her a thick folder, "it is about the inheritance case. Someone has filed a petition claiming your marriage was fraudulent, designed solely to secure control of the estate." Mark froze. "What?" Eleanor's face hardened. "Who filed it?" Whitmore hesitated. "Richard Harlan." Her jaw clenched, fury flashing in her eyes. "He wants the board to revoke my rights as chairwoman," she said bitterly. "And if he succeeds, everything my father built will fall into his hands." Mark stepped closer. "Then we fight back. Together." She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since their contract began, there was no pretense in her gaze. "Together," she said quietly. "No more pretending." Eleanor's world, once built on control and precision, began to shake under the weight of betrayal. The petition from Richard Harlan spread quickly through the corporate world, fueling headlines and speculation. The media called it the Brooks marriage scandal. Overnight, Eleanor's name, once synonymous with respect, became the subject of whispers and doubt. Her board of directors demanded an emergency hearing to review her leadership. For the first time in years, Eleanor seemed uncertain. Mark found her in the study late one night, surrounded by stacks of documents, her face pale and tired under the soft lamplight. "They want to strip me of everything my father left me," she said quietly. Mark stepped closer. "Then we will show them the truth." She looked up at him, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "And what is that truth, Mark? That I married a man half my age?" That I built my empire on lies? He shook his head. That you did what you had to do. That you fought for what was yours. And that you are not alone anymore. For the first time, her composure cracked. She pressed her lips together, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. You really believe we can win this? Mark's voice was steady. I believe in you. In the days leading up to the hearing, Mark stayed by Eleanor's side, reviewing legal strategies, helping her prepare statements, and standing as her silent support when the media surrounded their gates. Every morning, cameras lined the estate driveway, and every headline seemed designed to destroy them. Yet, through it all, Mark refused to back down. He became her shield against the chaos. When the day of the hearing arrived, the boardroom was packed with reporters, executives, and shareholders. Richard Harlan sat smugly at the end of the table, confident in his victory. Eleanor entered the room with Mark beside her, head held high, dressed in a tailored black suit that radiated power. The chairperson began, Mrs. Brooks, you stand accused of entering into a fraudulent marriage for financial gain. Do you have a defense? Eleanor glanced at Mark, then rose to speak. Her voice was calm but firm. Yes, I do. I married Mark Davis not for profit, but for partnership. What began as an arrangement became something real, something that changed both of us. You can strip me of titles, but you cannot strip me of integrity. My father taught me that true legacy is not built in boardrooms, but in the lives we touch. I intend to honor that, whether I remain your chairwoman or not. The room fell silent. Even Richard's smirk faded. When the decision came hours later, it was unanimous. The board voted in Eleanor's favor, rejecting Richard's claim entirely. The press outside erupted with questions, but Eleanor ignored them, walking out of the building hand in hand with Mark. As the doors closed behind them, she let out a long breath she did not know she had been holding. It is over, she whispered. Mark smiled softly. No, he said. It is just beginning. That night, back at the mansion, the staff greeted them with quiet smiles. Eleanor poured 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to Mark. You were right, she said. About what? He asked. About changing the rules. She raised her glass. To the truth. He clinked his against hers. To us. For the first time, the word us felt real, not written in ink but carved into the quiet spaces between their hearts. Months passed after the boardroom victory, and life at the Brooks estate began to settle into something neither Eleanor nor Mark could have imagined at the start of their arrangement. The tension, the contracts, the cold politeness, all of it had slowly melted into something far more human. The mansion, once a fortress of silence, now echoed with laughter, music, and the sound of shared life. Mark had officially completed his law degree, and Eleanor insisted on hosting a small celebration in the garden. Under strings of golden lights, surrounded by the people who had once worked for her in quiet fear but now smiled openly, Mark stood beside her, a different man from the one who had walked into that bistro months ago. Eleanor raised her glass and said softly, to second chances. And to finding what we never knew we needed. Mark looked at her, his heart full. To love, he said. The kind that was never in the contract. Everyone cheered, but for a moment it felt like the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them beneath the glowing lights. Later that night, when the guests had left and the mansion was quiet again, Eleanor and Mark walked together through the garden. The fountain sparkled under the moonlight, just as it had on the night they first began to understand each other. Do you ever think about how it all began? Mark asked, his voice soft. Eleanor smiled faintly. Every day. I remember that night in the bistro. I was so certain I could control everything, even love. She paused, turning to face him, and then you walked in and ruined all my plans. Mark laughed quietly. Ruined, or fixed? She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the moon. Maybe both. He reached for her hand, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no pretense, no contract, only truth. As they stood together, the distant city lights flickered like stars on the horizon. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. My father used to say that legacy is not about what you leave behind, but who you leave it with. Mark smiled. Then he would be proud of you. She turned toward him, her expression warm and unguarded. And what about you, Mr. Davis? Do you regret any of this? He shook his head slowly. Not a single moment. She smiled. Good. Because neither do I. The wind rustled through the roses, and for a long time they said nothing, content in the quiet simplicity of what they had found. What began as a business deal had become a promise, one built not on paper, but on trust, loyalty, and something deeper than either of them had dared to hope for. As dawn broke over the Brooks estate, light poured through the tall windows, touching the framed photo now resting on Eleanor's desk, a picture of her and Mark standing hand in hand at the children's education center they had rebuilt together. Beneath it was a small brass plaque that read, Brooks Foundation, Building Futures. Eleanor smiled every time she saw it. It was a reminder that the most important contracts are written not in ink, but in the heart. And so, the woman who once believed she needed no one found everything she had been missing in the man who once thought he had nothing. Sometimes love does not arrive as a fairy tale. Sometimes, it starts with a signature and ends with forever.